What happens when one of the most outspoken personalities in entertainment walks into a television studio where the questions are anything but friendly? Does the interview unfold like every other celebrity appearance? Or does it become the kind of exchange that has everyone replaying every word and debating who truly came out on top? Howard Stern has built his reputation on saying exactly what's on his mind, no matter who is sitting across from him. For decades, he's faced criticism, controversy, and countless attempts to challenge him in public. But every so often, a television appearance sparks a wave of discussion that goes far beyond the interview itself, leaving audiences wondering whether they just witnessed a brilliant defense, a heated confrontation, or something in between. This particular showdown has generated countless opinions, with some viewers claiming Howard completely changed the tone of the conversation through his calm confidence, while others argue the debate revealed just how quickly live television can become unpredictable when strong personalities refuse to back down. As the discussion intensified, the atmosphere reportedly shifted from a routine celebrity interview into a tense exchange where every question seemed sharper than the last. Every response carried extra weight, and every moment raised the stakes even higher. The room grew quieter, the reactions became harder to ignore, and it became increasingly clear that this was no longer an ordinary interview. Was Howard Stern simply defending himself against aggressive questioning? Or did he manage to turn the entire conversation around in a way that nobody expected? Stay with us, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why this television appearance continues to spark debate and why people still can't agree on who really won the exchange. Howard Stern has spent decades building a reputation unlike anyone else in broadcasting. Whether people admire him or strongly disagree with him, few would argue that he knows how to command a conversation. Throughout his career, he's interviewed world-famous celebrities, challenged public figures with uncomfortable questions, and built an audience by refusing to follow the traditional rules of media. That willingness to speak his mind has earned him loyal supporters, outspoken critics, and a place at the center of countless public debates. Because of that reputation, every major television appearance carries a certain level of anticipation. Viewers don't just tune in to hear what Howard has to say. They watch to see how he responds when someone decides to challenge him directly. His interviews often become unpredictable, not because he seeks confrontation for its own sake, but because he's known for responding quickly, confidently, and without appearing intimidated. Leading up to the appearance we're discussing today, expectations were already high. The show featured experienced television personalities known for asking direct questions and sharing strong opinions. Many viewers expected a lively discussion about Howard's career, his influence on modern media, and the controversies that have followed him over the years. On the surface, it looked like another celebrity interview. But beneath that expectation was the possibility that the conversation could become far more intense than anyone anticipated. From the moment Howard took his seat, the atmosphere reportedly felt different. The introductions were polite, yet there was an unmistakable sense of tension hanging over the discussion. Every comment seemed measured, every expression drew attention, and even the smallest pause felt significant. The audience could sense that both sides were prepared to defend their viewpoints, creating an atmosphere where every question carried extra weight. As the opening conversation unfolded, it became clear that neither side intended to avoid difficult topics. The discussion quickly moved beyond Howard's accomplishments and into broader questions about his public image, his style of broadcasting, and the impact of his work. What began as a routine interview gradually transformed into a sharper exchange of opinions, with each response increasing the tension inside the studio. The turning point arrived with a single-pointed question. Instead of offering the carefully rehearsed answer many guests might have given, Howard responded in a way that immediately changed the tone of the conversation. In that instant, the interview stopped feeling predictable. The balance of the discussion shifted, the energy inside the studio changed, and everyone watching realized they were witnessing something far more compelling than an ordinary celebrity appearance. The moment Howard Stern appeared on stage, the energy inside the studio reportedly felt noticeably different from a typical celebrity interview. The applause was warm, but underneath the excitement there seemed to be a sense of anticipation. Viewers knew Howard wasn't the kind of guest who relied on carefully rehearsed answers, and the hosts understood they were speaking with someone who had spent decades handling criticism in front of millions of people. From the opening moments, the conversation carried a more serious tone than many expected. Instead of beginning with lighthearted stories or promoting recent projects, the discussion quickly moved toward Howard's public image and the controversies that have followed him throughout his career. It was the kind of opening that immediately signaled this wouldn't be a routine interview. Howard, however, appeared completely composed. Rather than showing frustration or trying to steer the conversation somewhere safer, he remained relaxed, listening carefully before responding. His calm demeanor stood in sharp contrast to the increasingly direct nature of the questions, and that difference in approach quickly became one of the defining features of the exchange. As the first challenging remarks were made, many viewers felt the interview had already crossed into more confrontational territory. The questions no longer seemed focused solely on Howard's work. They touched on the broader reputation he has built over decades in broadcasting. For someone with less experience, that kind of opening might have been enough to put them on the defensive. Howard, however, showed little sign of discomfort. Instead of reacting emotionally, he answered with the confidence of someone who had spent years navigating difficult interviews. His responses were measured, direct, and delivered without raising his voice. That composure appeared to shift the atmosphere almost immediately. Rather than watching a guest struggle under pressure, the audience found themselves watching two very different communication styles begin to collide. Around the table, the mood reportedly became more cautious. Even before the conversation truly intensified, it was becoming clear that neither side intended to back away from its position. Every exchange carried a little more weight than the last, and every pause seemed just long enough to make viewers wonder what would be said next. By the end of those opening minutes, one thing had become obvious. Whatever expectations people had before the interview began, the discussion was already moving in an unexpected direction. The polite introductions were over, the difficult questions had arrived, and the stage was set for an exchange that many viewers would continue discussing long after the cameras stopped rolling. As the conversation settled into its rhythm, the discussion reportedly took another unexpected turn. Rather than focusing on Howard Stern's latest work or asking the kind of promotional questions celebrities usually expect, attention shifted toward the reputation he has carried throughout his career. It was the kind of question that seemed designed to test not only his opinions, but also the way he handled pressure when millions of people were watching. For many public figures, that moment might have marked the beginning of a defensive explanation. Instead, Howard appeared to take a different approach. He listened without interrupting, allowed the question to finish, and paused just long enough to show that he wasn't rushing into an emotional response. That brief silence created its own kind of tension, making viewers wonder exactly how he would answer. When Howard finally responded, his tone remained calm and controlled. Rather than reacting with visible frustration, he answered with a mixture of confidence and sharp wit. Instead of simply denying criticism or attempting to justify every controversy from his past, he reframed the conversation, encouraging everyone to think about the issue from a broader perspective. In doing so, he appeared to change the energy of the interview almost instantly. The atmosphere inside the studio reportedly shifted. The discussion no longer felt like a straightforward interview where one side asked questions and the other simply replied. It began to resemble a genuine debate, with each response opening the door to another challenging exchange. Viewers could sense that the interview was becoming increasingly unpredictable. As Howard continued speaking, his confidence seemed to grow rather than diminish. Years of experience behind a microphone had clearly prepared him for difficult conversations, and instead of appearing uncomfortable, he looked completely at ease. His answers were measured, deliberate, and delivered without any sign that he felt cornered. That confidence seemed to catch everyone by surprise. The discussion had started with the expectation that Howard would spend much of the interview defending himself against criticism. Instead, his responses reportedly made the conversation more balanced, forcing everyone involved to engage more carefully with each new point that was raised. The other hosts also appeared to recognize that the tone had changed. Small reactions, brief pauses, and thoughtful expressions suggested they understood this wasn't unfolding like an ordinary celebrity interview. Every comment now seemed to carry greater significance, and every response had the potential to push the conversation in an entirely new direction. For viewers watching at home, the momentum was becoming impossible to ignore. The interview had evolved from a series of difficult questions into a genuine exchange of ideas, with neither side willing to retreat from its position. Whatever happened next would likely determine whether the discussion remained a spirited debate or transformed into something far more memorable. And as the next question arrived, it became clear that the most intense part of the conversation was still ahead. Up to this point, the discussion had largely revolved around Howard Stern's career, his broadcasting style, and the controversies that have followed him over the years. But according to accounts of the exchange, the atmosphere changed noticeably when the focus shifted away from his work and toward his character. It was a subtle transition, yet one that completely altered the tone of the interview. Questions that had initially centered on professional choices now seemed to carry a more personal edge. Rather than debating ideas alone, the conversation began exploring motives, intentions, and the kind of influence Howard had on audiences. It was the type of shift that often determines whether an interview remains a thoughtful discussion or becomes a direct confrontation. Many viewers expected Howard to become defensive at that moment. After all, personal criticism can be far more difficult to answer than questions about someone's career. Instead, he appeared to remain remarkably composed. His body language suggested confidence rather than frustration, and he continued responding with the same measured pace that had defined the interview from the beginning. Rather than matching emotion with emotion, Howard reportedly chose a different strategy. He redirected the discussion toward consistency and fairness. Instead of focusing only on defending himself, he encouraged the conversation to examine whether the same standards were being applied to everyone involved. That subtle shift changed the dynamic once again. As the discussion continued, it no longer felt like one person answering difficult questions. Instead, it began to resemble two experienced communicators testing each other's arguments in real time. Every answer introduced another point to consider, and every response seemed to invite an even more challenging follow-up. The exchange became increasingly layered, with both sides trying to establish the stronger position. The atmosphere inside the studio reportedly grew noticeably quieter. The interruptions became less frequent, and the pauses between responses seemed longer than before. Those brief moments of silence carried almost as much weight as the dialogue itself, allowing viewers to appreciate the growing tension without anyone needing to raise their voice. Howard's calm approach appeared to become one of his greatest advantages. Rather than speaking faster or louder as the pressure increased, he maintained the same controlled delivery. That consistency made each reply feel more deliberate, giving the impression that he was carefully considering every word instead of reacting impulsively. Meanwhile, the discussion itself had evolved beyond the original topic. It was no longer simply about Howard Stern or the controversies surrounding his career. It had become a broader conversation about criticism, accountability, and what happens when people who are accustomed to asking difficult questions suddenly find themselves answering them instead. By this stage, it was becoming increasingly clear that the interview had taken on a life of its own. Whatever expectations viewers had at the beginning of the program had largely disappeared. The conversation had entered entirely new territory, and the balance of momentum seemed to be shifting with every exchange. And with that shift came the moment that would define the rest of the interview. The questions were no longer one-sided. The discussion was becoming more intense by the minute, and the next exchange would determine who truly controlled the direction of the conversation. By this stage of the conversation, something had noticeably changed. What had reportedly begun as an interview focused on Howard Stern was no longer following the usual format. Instead of simply responding to increasingly difficult questions, Howard appeared to shift the direction of the discussion itself. It wasn't done through raised voices or dramatic gestures, but through carefully chosen questions that encouraged everyone at the table to examine the conversation from a different angle. Rather than rushing to defend every criticism aimed at him, Howard reportedly began asking whether the same expectations being placed on him were applied consistently to others. It was a subtle but significant change. The discussion was no longer centered solely on explaining his past decisions. Instead, it became a broader conversation about fairness, public criticism, and the responsibilities that come with having a platform. That shift seemed to catch everyone off guard. For most celebrity interviews, the guest remains in the position of answering while the hosts guide the conversation. But as the exchange continued, the balance appeared to change. Howard's responses became more than simple answers. They encouraged reflection, challenged assumptions, and invited the hosts to respond to questions of their own. The atmosphere reportedly became even more intense. Every reply seemed to introduce another layer to the debate, making it increasingly difficult for anyone to return to the original interview format. The discussion had become more spontaneous, with each side carefully weighing its next words. One of the most striking aspects of the exchange was Howard's consistency. Even as the conversation grew more heated, he appeared determined to keep his tone steady. He didn't seem interested in winning through volume or emotion. Instead, he relied on calm reasoning and confidence, allowing his points to unfold naturally rather than forcing them into the discussion. Around the table, reactions reportedly became more noticeable. Short pauses replaced quick interruptions, and expressions often revealed as much as the dialogue itself. It seemed as though everyone recognized that the interview had reached a point where every sentence could influence the direction of the conversation. For viewers, this was the moment when the interview reportedly stopped feeling like a routine media appearance. It had become an unpredictable exchange between experienced communicators, each trying to establish credibility while responding to growing pressure. The original questions had given way to a much larger debate about media, public perception, and accountability. As the discussion continued, it became increasingly difficult to predict what would happen next. The momentum no longer belonged entirely to one side, and the conversation seemed to take on a life of its own. Every new response carried the possibility of changing the entire dynamic once again. And just when it seemed the tension couldn't rise any higher, the atmosphere reportedly grew even quieter. The room appeared to be waiting for the next exchange, knowing it could become the defining moment of the entire interview. As the discussion continued, the atmosphere reportedly became more intense with every passing minute. What had started as a challenging interview now seemed to evolve into a conversation where every pause, every response, and every expression carried added significance. It no longer felt like anyone was following a prepared script. Instead, both sides appeared to be reacting in real time, making the exchange increasingly unpredictable. The other hosts around the table seemed to recognize that the conversation had reached an unusual point. Rather than jumping into the discussion immediately, they appeared more cautious, carefully choosing when, or even whether, to speak. Short moments of silence began filling the space between responses, creating a level of tension that viewers could almost feel through the screen. Howard, meanwhile, reportedly maintained the same calm demeanor that had defined the interview from the beginning. Even as the questions became more pointed and the discussion grew more personal, he didn't appear rushed or flustered. His steady pace contrasted sharply with the increasingly emotional tone of the conversation, making his responses seem even more deliberate. That composure may have been one of the biggest reasons the momentum continued to shift. Instead of matching intensity with intensity, Howard appeared to let the conversation unfold naturally, allowing each response to build on the previous one. It was a style that reflected years of experience handling difficult interviews, where patience often proved more effective than confrontation. As the exchange progressed, the reactions around the table reportedly became harder to ignore. Subtle glances between the hosts, brief hesitations before speaking, and thoughtful expressions suggested that everyone understood the discussion had moved well beyond its original purpose. The focus was no longer limited to Howard's career. It had expanded into a broader debate about criticism, accountability, and the way public conversations are conducted. For viewers watching from home, this shift likely made the interview even more compelling. The uncertainty surrounding each new exchange created a sense of anticipation. No one could be completely sure what the next question would be or how it would be answered. That unpredictability became one of the defining features of the entire conversation. According to many who discussed the interview afterward, the room itself seemed noticeably quieter. Audience reactions appeared more restrained, with attention fixed on every word being spoken. Rather than interrupting the flow with constant applause or laughter, the audience seemed content simply to observe, understanding that the discussion had reached a particularly important stage. What made the moment especially fascinating was that neither side appeared willing to retreat. Each response invited another question, and every answer seemed to raise the stakes a little higher. The interview had become less about disagreement and more about who could remain composed under increasing pressure. By now, it reportedly felt as though the conversation had reached a crossroads. The next major exchange would determine whether the interview settled back into a more traditional format or moved toward the defining moment that so many viewers would later remember. And as the tension continued to build, it became clear that the most significant part of the discussion was still yet to come. Every memorable interview has a turning point, a single exchange that changes how the rest of the conversation is remembered. According to many discussions surrounding this appearance, That moment reportedly arrived just as the tension inside the studio seemed to reach its highest level. By then, both sides had made their positions clear, but it was the next response that appeared to redefine the entire conversation. Rather than becoming more emotional as the pressure increased, Howard Stern seemed to become even more composed. Instead of rushing to answer or speaking over anyone, he reportedly paused, gathered his thoughts, and delivered a response in the same calm, measured tone he had maintained from the beginning. That consistency stood out because the atmosphere around him had become increasingly intense. The effect was immediate. The discussion no longer felt like a standard celebrity interview where difficult questions were met with carefully rehearsed answers. Instead, it had evolved into an exchange where every statement carried significant weight. Viewers weren't simply listening for information anymore. They were paying attention to how each person handled the growing pressure. What made this moment particularly noteworthy wasn't necessarily the volume of anyone's voice or the drama of the exchange. It was the contrast between calm confidence and rising tension. Howard's approach reportedly remained steady, allowing his arguments to unfold without appearing hurried or defensive. That style gave his words additional impact, encouraging both the hosts and the audience to focus on the substance of what was being said rather than the emotion surrounding it. Around the table, the reactions appeared increasingly restrained. Brief pauses became longer, expressions became more thoughtful, and the pace of the conversation slowed just enough to emphasize the importance of each response. It reportedly felt as though everyone understood that the interview had entered its most significant phase. For many viewers, this was the point where perceptions of the conversation began to shift. What had initially seemed like a challenging interview now appeared to become a broader discussion about public accountability, criticism, and the way difficult conversations unfold on live television. The original topic was still present, but it had expanded into something much larger. Howard also seemed determined not to allow the discussion to become purely emotional. According to accounts of the exchange, he continued returning to the central issues that had been raised, resisting the temptation to turn the conversation into a personal argument. Whether viewers agreed with his perspective or not, many acknowledged that his composure became one of the defining characteristics of the interview. As the exchange continued, it reportedly became more difficult for anyone in the studio to ignore the shift in momentum. The conversation had taken on an entirely different rhythm. Instead of one side directing every question, the discussion now felt more balanced, with each response influencing where the interview would go next. The audience, both inside the studio and watching from home, seemed to recognize that they were witnessing the most memorable part of the entire appearance. Every sentence carried added significance, and every pause increased the anticipation of what might come next. It was no longer just about Howard Stern or the questions being asked. It had become a test of composure, communication, and the ability to remain confident under intense public scrutiny. By the time this defining exchange came to an end, one thing reportedly seemed certain. Whatever happened during the remainder of the interview would be viewed through the lens of this moment. The tone had changed, the momentum had shifted, and the discussion was now moving toward its final and most decisive stage. By this stage of the interview, it reportedly seemed clear that everyone involved understood the conversation had moved far beyond its original purpose. What began as a discussion about Howard Stern's career and public image had transformed into a much broader debate, and there was no simple way to return to lighter topics without acknowledging everything that had already been said. According to accounts of the exchange, an effort was eventually made to steer the conversation toward a different subject. Under ordinary circumstances, that might have been enough to ease the tension and restore the familiar rhythm of a daytime television interview. But this time, the moment felt different. The earlier discussion had raised questions that neither side appeared willing to leave unanswered. Howard reportedly recognized the attempt to move on and responded with the same calm confidence that had characterized his approach from the beginning. As the conversation moved into its final stretch, the focus reportedly began shifting beyond the exchange itself. It was no longer only about the questions being asked or the answers being given. Increasingly, viewers found themselves paying attention to the reactions around the studio. Sometimes, a person's expression can say more than a lengthy speech, and according to many who watched or later discussed the interview, those silent reactions became one of the most memorable parts of the entire appearance. The atmosphere reportedly felt unusually restrained. Earlier moments of quick back-and-forth discussion had given way to longer pauses, allowing each statement to settle before the next response arrived. Those brief moments of silence carried their own kind of tension, making it seem as though everyone present understood they were witnessing a conversation that had taken an unexpected direction. The other hosts appeared to become increasingly selective about when to enter the discussion. Rather than speaking over one another or rushing to fill every pause, they seemed to observe carefully, listening as the exchange continued to unfold. Whether this reflected caution, curiosity, or simple surprise became part of the debate among viewers after the program aired. Audience reactions also reportedly changed as the conversation progressed. Instead of frequent applause or laughter, many described the room as becoming noticeably quieter, with attention focused almost entirely on the discussion. Every response seemed to receive careful consideration before anyone reacted, adding to the feeling that the interview had become far more significant than anyone initially expected. Howard, meanwhile, appeared to maintain the same steady composure that had defined his approach throughout the conversation. While the atmosphere around him reportedly grew more intense, his delivery remained controlled and deliberate. That consistency continued to stand out, especially as the discussion entered what many considered its most critical stage. One reason this moment attracted so much attention afterward was the contrast it created. On one side was a conversation that had become increasingly serious. On the other was a guest who, according to many accounts, appeared determined to remain calm regardless of how challenging the questions became. That contrast shaped much of the public discussion that followed. The studio itself reportedly reflected that growing tension. Small gestures, thoughtful expressions, and extended pauses seemed to communicate that everyone recognized the importance of the moment. Even without dramatic interruptions or raised voices, the conversation carried an intensity that many viewers found difficult to ignore. By now, it was becoming clear that the interview had taken on a momentum of its own. What started as a discussion about Howard Stern's career had evolved into a broader conversation about media, criticism, accountability, and the dynamics of live television. Regardless of individual opinions, many agreed that the exchange had become one of those rare television moments that audiences continue analyzing long after the broadcast ends. As the final exchanges drew closer, anticipation reportedly reached its highest point. The discussion had already generated memorable moments, but there was still one question left unanswered. How would it all end? Would the conversation conclude with mutual understanding, an effort to move forward, or one final statement that would leave the strongest impression of all? That uncertainty kept viewers fully engaged until the very last moments of the interview. As the interview reportedly entered its final moments, there was a noticeable sense that both sides understood the conversation had reached its conclusion. The major arguments had already been made, the tension had steadily built over the course of the discussion, and now everything seemed to depend on the final exchange. In many memorable television interviews, it is the closing moments that audiences remember most, and according to those who have discussed this appearance, this was no exception. Rather than allowing the conversation to end abruptly, Howard Stern reportedly took one last opportunity to summarize his perspective. His approach remained consistent with everything viewers had seen throughout the interview. He didn't appear interested in dramatic speeches or emotional outbursts. Instead, he calmly returned to the central themes that had defined the discussion from the very beginning: fairness, accountability, and the importance of applying the same standards to everyone involved. By this point, the atmosphere inside the studio reportedly felt completely different from the one that had existed at the start of the interview. Earlier confidence had been replaced by careful pauses, measured responses, and a greater awareness that every remaining sentence would likely shape how viewers remembered the exchange. It was no longer simply about answering questions. It had become about leaving a lasting impression. The hosts also appeared to recognize that the discussion was drawing to a close. According to many viewers, there seemed to be less interest in extending the debate and more focus on bringing the interview to a respectful conclusion. After such an intense exchange, continuing to revisit the same arguments might only have repeated points that had already been made. Howard, however, reportedly delivered one final observation that many people later highlighted when discussing the interview. Without raising his voice or changing his calm demeanor, he emphasized that audiences are ultimately capable of reaching their own conclusions. Public figures can defend their positions, explain their decisions, and debate difficult issues. But in the end, viewers decide for themselves which arguments they find the most convincing. That message appeared to resonate with many people because it shifted the focus away from personal disagreement and back toward the audience. Rather than declaring victory or attempting to have the last word for its own sake, the discussion reportedly ended with the idea that public opinion, not any single participant, would ultimately determine how the exchange would be remembered. Around the studio, the atmosphere reportedly reflected a mixture of relief and reflection. The most intense part of the conversation had passed, yet there remained a sense that everyone was still processing what had just unfolded. Sometimes the strongest television moments are not defined by shouting or dramatic gestures, but by the silence that follows an important exchange, when every participant realizes the discussion has reached its natural conclusion. For viewers at home, the final moments seemed to leave a lasting impression. Supporters of Howard pointed to his composure and willingness to stand by his views under pressure. Others believed the interview simply demonstrated how passionate debates can quickly become deeply personal when strong personalities refuse to back away from difficult questions. Whichever interpretation people preferred, few seemed to argue that the interview had been ordinary. As the program reportedly prepared to move on, one thing had become increasingly clear. What began as another celebrity appearance had grown into one of those conversations that audiences continued discussing long after the broadcast ended. The questions, the responses, and especially the final exchange had ensured that the interview would remain part of ongoing conversations about media, public debate, and the unpredictable nature of live television. And although the cameras were preparing to move forward, the discussion itself was far from over. In many ways, it was only beginning, as viewers across social media and entertainment news continued debating exactly what they had witnessed, and who, if anyone, had truly come out ahead. Long after the interview reportedly came to an end, the conversation surrounding it was far from over. In fact, for many viewers, the broadcast itself became only the beginning. Discussions quickly spread across entertainment news, opinion pieces, online forums, and social media, where people began breaking down every exchange, every pause, and every response in an effort to determine exactly what had happened and what it all meant. What made the interview so memorable wasn't simply that it featured two outspoken personalities. Television has seen countless heated debates over the years. According to many observers, what set this discussion apart was the way it reportedly unfolded. There were no dramatic walkouts, no over-the-top theatrics, and no sensational stunts. Instead, much of the attention centered on communication itself, how difficult questions were asked, how they were answered, and how composure became just as important as the arguments being made. Supporters of Howard Stern argued that the interview demonstrated one of the qualities that has defined his career for decades: the ability to remain calm while responding to criticism. They pointed to his willingness to engage directly with uncomfortable topics rather than avoiding them, suggesting that his confidence under pressure became one of the defining aspects of the exchange. For these viewers, the discussion reinforced the image of Howard as someone who rarely backs away from a difficult conversation. Others viewed the interview differently. Some believed the exchange highlighted the challenges that come with live television, where spontaneous discussions can quickly become more intense than anyone anticipates. From that perspective, the interview served as a reminder that strong personalities, differing viewpoints, and the pressure of a live audience can transform even a routine conversation into something far more memorable. Another reason the discussion reportedly continued attracting attention was the broader issues it appeared to raise. Beyond the personalities involved, many viewers interpreted the interview as part of a larger conversation about media, accountability, and the expectations placed on public figures. Questions about fairness, criticism, and consistency extended well beyond the studio, encouraging audiences to reflect on how these debates unfold across television, radio, and digital platforms. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of the reaction was that there never seemed to be a single, universally accepted interpretation. Every clip, every quote, and every analysis generated another round of discussion. Some focused on Howard's communication style, others examined the host's approach, while many simply appreciated witnessing an unscripted exchange that felt different from the carefully managed interviews audiences often expect. In today's media landscape, moments like these can take on a life of their own. A single interview can be replayed, analyzed, debated, and interpreted from dozens of different angles within hours. Whether people viewed the exchange as a display of confidence, a clash of personalities, or an example of the unpredictability of live broadcasting, The fact that it continued generating discussion suggested that it had struck a chord with a wide audience. And perhaps that's the real reason people are still talking about it today. Memorable television isn't always defined by who wins or loses an argument. More often, it's remembered because it encourages people to keep asking questions long after the cameras stop rolling. The conversations continue, opinions evolve, and viewers revisit the exchange searching for details they may have missed the first time. Whatever conclusion each viewer ultimately reaches, one thing seems difficult to dispute. This interview became far more than an ordinary celebrity appearance. It sparked widespread discussion, inspired countless interpretations, and reminded audiences why unscripted television can still capture public attention in a way that few other forms of media can. And that lasting conversation may be the most significant part of the story of all. As the discussion reportedly came to a close, one thing had become increasingly clear. What was expected to be another celebrity interview had evolved into one of those rare television moments that continued generating conversation long after the broadcast ended. Whether viewers watched the exchange live or discovered it later through clips and commentary, many found themselves asking the same question. What really happened during that interview, and who handled the pressure better? Howard Stern has spent much of his career facing criticism, controversy, and difficult questions. That reputation has made him one of the most recognizable and debated figures in modern broadcasting. Moments like this, whether people view them as a display of composure or simply an intense exchange between strong personalities, continue to shape how audiences see both the people involved and the broader world of live television. At the same time, interviews like this remind us why unscripted conversations remain so compelling. Unlike carefully edited productions, live discussions leave little room for second chances. Every response, every pause, and every decision unfolds in real time, allowing millions of viewers to form their own opinions as events develop. That unpredictability is part of what keeps audiences coming back. Of course, public reactions remain divided. Some believe Howard demonstrated remarkable confidence under pressure, while others argue the interview simply reflected the challenges of navigating strong disagreements in a live broadcast. Neither perspective tells the entire story on its own, which is exactly why the conversation has continued long after the program ended. In the end, the most important judgment doesn't belong to television hosts, media commentators, or online headlines. It belongs to the audience. Every viewer brings a different perspective, notices different details, and reaches different conclusions. That's what makes moments like these so memorable. They don't end when the cameras stop rolling. They continue every time someone watches, analyzes, and debates what really took place. Now we'd like to hear from you. After everything you've heard, how do you interpret this widely discussed television exchange? Do you think Howard Stern handled the situation with exceptional composure? Or do you believe the conversation could have unfolded differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because respectful discussions often reveal perspectives that headlines alone never can. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most talked about celebrity interviews, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next breakdown of the biggest stories, unforgettable interviews, and the television moments everyone is still talking about. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.